Hi, welcome to your 11th C# Edge tutorial. Today we're discussing JavaScript variables versus C# variables. And your first impression might be, why would we even do that? JavaScript is so radically different from C#. JavaScript is always associated with the web page and is used to make the web page more interactive. JavaScript is a scripting language that is interpreted by the browser more or less at runtime, although partially at load time when the page is getting loaded. And C# is compiled into standalone exe programs that usually run on a computer by itself. They're not really run off the internet, although possibly they could be. And they're also sometimes compiled into .dll files that are referenced by exe files. And one of the reasons for the comparison is they're both really languages derived from C and C++. They have the same mother language, and the languages have probably more similarities than differences when you get into constructs like if and for and so on. In terms of variables, JavaScript is weakly typed and C# is strongly typed, which you'll see in a moment what I mean by that when I show you examples. And both JavaScript and C# variables must start with either a letter or an underscore. Both JavaScript and C# variables cannot contain special characters like %, or £, or @ and so on. JavaScript and C# variables consist only of letters, underscore, and numbers, but they can't begin with a number. So let's look at some examples. These are examples of C# strongly typed variables. And these are global variables defined at the top of the class that you get automatically when you create a Windows application using the IDE. The first variable is an int ix, which contains whole numbers like 1, 2, 3, 0, -1, -2, and so on. The next two variables, which are separated by a comma and put on the same line, are str and str2, and these are strings that can contain statements such as I am human or any statement you want. The next two variables are bools or booleans, which basically are truth variables. They can only contain one of two key words, true or false. And that's true both in C# and JavaScript. And generally speaking, the true and false are all lowercase letters. And the last C# example is a float. The name of it is my bank balance, and it can contain numbers containing a decimal point, such as 4.56. And in every case, there's other variables, like with the int you can have a byte, short, a long, and these just represent variables that can contain larger or shorter numbers. And with float you can contain a double. You can have a double, which contains a much larger floating point number. But if we look at the JavaScript equivalent, we have like global variables that are within the script tags on a web page, and these have var ix equals 23, and the reason we know ix is an integer is because it's set equal to an integer. That's what's meant by weakly typed. And in fact, later on in the program we could set ix equal to a string, and this would suddenly become a string. So variables can vary, unlike C#, where once you define it as a certain type, it's always going to be that type. And the next example is string, where we say var string equals the days of wine and roses. And these are delimited by quotation marks to indicate they're a string. You have to have quotation marks around this string, and you have to not have quotation marks around things like bool and int and float type JavaScript variables. And here we have two booleans in JavaScript, and the reason they're boolean is specifically because one is set to true and one is set to false. Nothing is true equals true and everything equals false. Kind of a cynical point of view. And finally we have a floating point variable, var my balance equals 7.23, which is pretty close to what my bank balance actually is. And one point I wanted to make by describing this way is, in terms of global variables, you can say var and then the variable name, or you can just specify the variable, and there's no difference. I have no idea why there's two different variations in terms of global. They actually make sense when we start talking about scopes of variables in the next lesson. But in terms of this first tutorial, which I'm just talking about C# data types versus JavaScript data types, it doesn't matter. The var and no var in front of it is essentially the same thing. Well, I hope you learned a lot from this tutorial and you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'm going to have several tutorials in a row comparing different things in JavaScript to different things in C#, like objects and functions and scopes of variables and so on. I'll see you in the following tutorials.